Now on BBC One, using for the first time extracts from the BBC's confidential archive, the inside story of Auntie continues.
Dear Jean Metcalf, please play something by Marino Marini. On two-way family favourites for my son in Germany.
Mrs. Olga Cremon requests the pleasure of Mr. Kenneth Horn's company.
As the 60s began, compulsory national service ended. Television was still black and white, and a £4 licence brought you the first ever live coverage of the Grand National and the wedding of the year.
Something for the benefit of the country as a whole. What should it be, I thought? Become a blood donor or join the Young Conservatives? You came
down for a stick 5 mile long.
Cannot go to society.
May you always be a dreamer.
This senseless, evil killing. There's a new traitorous scarf, git.
By 1960, BBC programme makers were already less stuffy, and they welcomed a new boss for the new decade. Hugh Carlton Green had been a newspaper reporter in Berlin in the 30s and had run the BBC's broadcasts to Germany during the war. As the new Director General greeted the Queen at the recently completed television centre, he already had plans to shake up Auntie's settled ways.
Hugh Green was the first Director General who had a reputation as a practicing broadcaster. All of us in programmes, working in programmes, felt a great excitement when such a person was going to become Director General. It had never happened before. Not only that, but he was also known to be iconoclastic.
Radio was ticking over perfectly well, though one felt that perhaps something needed to be done to bring it more into the modern world.
Well, how about that then, the end of what in polite society is referred to as make way for music?
One's main concern at that time was television, because of the very successful competition by ITV. The BBC share of the audience had gone down in the late 50s to barely more than a quarter, and something clearly had to be done about that.
Viewers had already begun to return to the BBC when a realistic police series became an instant success. The theme tune was so popular, it stayed in the top 20 for 10 weeks. Z-Cars steered clear of the cosy image of the local bobby.
Z-Cars was a sort of overnight revolution in the way of presenting police series, as opposed to the rather cosy way that Dixon of Dock Green handled it. Z-Cars was full of vitality.
One team of villains in prison is worth 100 false alarms. Good night.
An alarm call.
St. Victor 1 will call.
Well, thank God for that.
Cue and cut. There's no scoopers! The scoopers are in there! No, there's nobody there.
There might be 400, maybe even 500 shots in that 50 minutes.
Cue and cut. I'm telling you!
You know, there was no looking down at the script to see what came next. One just had to learn it by heart. It was a pretty hefty hour.
I'll be all right. There was a real buzz about the place, and I can remember we would try the makeups out quite early on, and this person was supposed to have been in a car accident. And so we tried out all the cuts and bruising to the face and to the hands. His hands had to be badly damaged as part of the script. And then he went to the coffee bar to have his coffee break, and there was a new person on the coffees, and she wasn't really looking up. She was busy pouring all the coffees and the teas out, and first of all this horrendous hand came forward to get the cup of coffee, and then she travelled up the hand, up the arm to the face, which was absolutely horrendous and pouring blood, and she just disappeared behind the coffee bar. We didn't see her again that day.
Success depended on good scripts. Two young hopefuls began by turning out jokes at 5 shillings a time. Soon they were writing for Tony Hancock.
I mean, I came in here in all good faith to help me country. I don't mind giving a reasonable amount, but a pint, that's very nearly an armful.
I mean, Ray and I were phenomena because of our age. Apart from we were known as the tallest and youngest scriptwriters in the business. We were 21 when we started. I mean, most of the people just come in their late 20s, coming out from the army.
After we split with Hancock, Tom Sloan, who was the head of the department, he called us into his office and he said, right, he said, I've got 10 half-hour blank spots, and he said, you can fill them up. And they said, with what you like. He said, you can write what you like, any subject you like, you can be in it, you can direct it, you can produce it. It's yours. You know, I must keep the title, Comedy Playhouse.
With Steptoe, it was desperation. We couldn't think of an idea. We'd gone weeks or certainly days, you know, without thinking, you know, of anything in the middle of Comedy Playhouse, and we got to the stage where we were reaching the deadline. Anyway, Ray one morning said, 2 rag and bone men walking down.
It wasn't called Steptoe, it was called The Offer.
No, see? OK.
And Tom Stone came down to the rehearsal and he sidled up to us and said, you know what you've got here, don't you? And we feigned innocence and said, no, what? He said, it's a series.
I think the greatest achievement of television in the 1960s was to produce an oral and a visual language which school leavers at 16 would understand and university graduates would not despise. The series which I think achieved this to a very great extent was Steptoe and Son, which eventually attracted something like 27 million people to watch it. Now 27 million people is virtually half the population at the time. Is a cultural achievement of the first order.
Chateau Margaux. We got any Chateau Margaux?
Any barriers that were pushed back were really subject matter, you know, and dealing with the emotions of the 2 people involved.
Give us a shot.
I mean, the swear, the language, I mean, compared with what goes on today, was totally mild.
Very.
And it all started with one episode where they were trying to move a piano, sent it in. Half an hour after it had reached the BBC, a phone call from Duncan Wood, the producer, and he said, I'll do my best, but I'm not sure. Now, we knew exactly what he meant. It was the use of the word bleeding. And he went to Tom Sloan, the aforesaid head of Light Entertainment, and he read it, and he said, it will be changed over my dead body. I will stake my career on bleeding.
We learnt a very valuable lesson today, mate. Huh? What's that? What goes up can bleed and must stay up there.
I mean, that was the week that was one of the boundary stretchers in terms of what you could make jokes about, you know, subject matter like politicians particularly.
That was the week that was. It's over, let it be. But what a week it was.
The Conservative government had been in power for 13 years, and governments get tired and they get sleazy and they get boring and all the rest of it.
That was the week that was. The bunnies are here, no doubt.
We thought we'd get an audience of about 2.5 million, and within 6 weeks we had an audience of 11 million.
A Queen Elizabeth doll and a Jackie Kennedy doll with interchangeable underwear have been on sale in a New York store. The Jackie Kennedy doll has now been withdrawn because the White House thought it undignified.
we were probably going for sacred cows which hadn't been mocked at all before, and so immediately there was a feeling for the audience of being let in to some secret which had perhaps been kept from them before.
Here comes more frost and snow. If you'd like to keep us...
It did something to change the atmosphere in the BBC. It did something to change the public view of the BBC. And after the first episode, some newspaper men rang up Reg Bevins, the Postmaster General in Macmillan's government, and said, "You're going to stand for this? Surely you must do something about it." The next morning, he found a very short memo on his desk from the Prime Minister Macmillan.
Postmaster General, I hope you will not, repeat not, take any action about that was the week that was without consulting me. It's a good thing to be laughed at. It is better than to be ignored.
And just a postscript. Something like, remember, life is better under the Conservatives.
It was very successful in its first season, the winter of 62 to 63. When it came back on the air, it seemed, in the autumn of 63, it seemed to have lost some of its sparkle. I wasn't very happy about the programme. There was too much of what some of the governors, particularly James Duff, regarded as smut.
This plank is not to be carried on the stage at the erotic angle at which it's been carried at the present.
The moment they were given the weapon of silly schoolboy smut, then people were seeing smut at every corner. And I don't think the first 2 or 3 programmes that we did when we came back on the air were as good. As I say, we were probably trying too hard.
And I decided that the programme really had to come off the air before the spring of 1964. Partly because 1964 was bound to be an election year, and I was doubtful about the use of laughter on political issues to that extent.
That was the week that was. It's over, let it go. Oh, what a week that was.
And he'd been under pressure from the board, heavily. And he announced in November that it would cease in the spring, and the excuse was given that it was because of the election, but that was Codswallop, actually. They lost their nerve.
On the one hand, Lord Hume, and on the other hand, Mr. Harold Wilson. Dull Alec versus Smart Alec.
By the time of the 60s, and especially with the emergence of That Was the Week That Was, suddenly the politicians began to realise that here was a medium which could make or break political reputations in a way that they hadn't understood before. Sir Alec Douglas Hume became Prime Minister, took over from Macmillan. He looked rather sort of aristocratic, fuddy-duddy, out of touch, and the That Was the Week That Was programme really made fun of Sir Alec, and he told me afterwards that he thought that had helped contribute to his election defeat.
Hi there, pop pickers. It's me again, and Sunday at 4 means pick of the pops.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah.
Aside from satire, the government was shaken even more when Defence Minister John Profumo was caught in a security scandal involving call girls. His resignation had rocked the Conservative government. With the general election over and a Labour government in number 10, the Director General went on the offensive again to shake up BBC drama.
The important moment was when Sidney Newman, a Canadian, who had been in charge of drama with one of the commercial programme companies, ABC, was lured to the BBC. I was much involved in the luring.
The new head of drama was not impressed by his department's work.
I shall not fail, Your Majesty. Much depends upon it. That letter will strengthen our armies in the West.
It was all rather stagey,
The material used didn't really cater to what I assumed to be the mass British audience. It was still the attitude, not of elitist, but the BBC drama was still catering to a highly educated, cultured class rather than the mass audience, which was not aware of culture as such and had no real background.
Oh, aye, they're a golden pair, blessed with everything, health, good looks.
While Newman planned a whole new range of drama, he inherited some popular successes.
What I can't understand, though, what with Ian's rugby and Peggy's tennis.
Oh, aye, the wonder is how they found time to conceive it.
Dr. Cameron?
I'm taking this wee bit of string, Janet.
Sidney was a tremendously vital sort of man, and he came in like a breath of fresh air. He immediately divided drama into 3 separate departments: plays, series, and serials, each with a head in charge of those 3 things. He was a tremendously colourful character.
But the BBC's first demand on Sidney Newman was not for mainstream drama.
Could I dream up some kind of drama that would cater to children, which would be livelier and so on? And so I dreamed up the idea of Doctor Who.
Sidney did want an educational thrust so that the scientific side of it was based in some kind of reality. I hadn't really done science at school, so I didn't really understand any of it, which I think was a bit of a disappointment to Sidney. And he had said to me very, very much at the beginning, he said, you must not have what he called BEMs, which are bug-eyed monsters.
None of these creepy, crawly things from outer space, the usual nonsense of science fiction stuff. And then she came out with this Dalek business, and I was livid with anger.
Make no attempt to capture them. They are to be exterminated. You understand? Exterminated. I understand.
We put the Dalek serial out, and of course it catapulted Doctor Who immediately into being this incredibly successful show. And I think though Sidney was very cross with me about these BEMs, he was, of course, also very pleased that it was such a success and so quickly.
Before you attempt to conquer the Earth, you will have to destroy all living matter.
Take them. Take them.
Sidney Newman had appointed Verity Lambert at a time when most television departments had very few, if any, women producers.
We are the masters of Earth. We are the masters of Earth.
And I think it actually says more about the man than the period, because what I did want to direct, and I couldn't even get aboard as a director because I was a woman. And it was unusual for women to be given responsible jobs in those days, and it certainly was very unusual to go from being a production assistant to a producer.
What was really rather bad was the way women were treated. It was very, very difficult for a girl to become a producer, and the general career development of a woman was by being a secretary.
Darling, have you got the stopwatch with you? Yes. And we'll take a rough timing. We won't get much of an idea. Is that okay?
In a way, it was quite amusing because not only was I a woman, but in the drama department, I think I was a good 15 years younger than any of the men. So I'd be introduced to them, and you would see this sort of look of shock and horror go over their faces before they rearranged them into a sort of polite smile.
One area where women were treated on more equal terms was children's programs.
Hello there.
Hello.
Hello. Bet you've never seen hats like these before. They're called zany hats, and they've all got one thing in common: they're made from poultry feathers. And recently they were entered for a competition, the 1966 Poultry Feather Hat Competition.
The great attraction for children was that the programme involved them so much. I mean, we really did care about what they thought. We had their letters. In the end, about 70% of the content of each programme arose through their ideas. We gave them tremendous power. The appeals gave them great power. We asked for 60,000 paperback books to buy an inshore rescue boat for the RNLI. Well, we got 240,000 of these books.
And it gives me great pleasure to name this launch Blue Peter 1, and God bless all who sail in her.
I named this launch Blue Peter 2.
I name this launch Blue Peter 3.
By 1963, the BBC had won back 45% of the television audience. It had also persuaded the government that a new TV channel should be given to the BBC, not to ITV. But the channel controller started without the staff or the studios he needed.
I found myself in charge early in '63, at the age of 34, facing the rather daunting prospect of starting a new channel with really very little preparation. We had to recruit 1,000 program people. The monies available were very limited. It became very clear to me that even no matter how I looked at it, we weren't going to be able to create more than about 15, 16 hours of original television, and yet I had a general commitment to offer at least 25 hours a week of television on BBC Two.
Even the opening night flopped when a fire at Battersea Power Station blacked out the BBC. The new channel had to start the next day.
Good evening. This is BBC Two.
We didn't know at the time, but it turned out that the way you start a service on a particular channel has an enormous influence on the way viewers and listeners will regard it. And because it started in such a didactic way, it, on the whole, for many years, had rather few viewers, because people made up their minds that it was a highbrow service which was for the knobs and not for them.
The shortage of good programs forced BBC Two to devote one night a week to education and another to repeats.
BBC Two transmitters open today, so we begin by welcoming everyone who hasn't been with us before to Late Night Lineup.
BBC Two took 3 years to spread from London to the regions, and viewers had to buy a new set and aerial. But there were good new programs too.
What do you think would happen if you couldn't come here?
Well, I think in the first place my husband would complain.
On what grounds?
Because he always welcomes what comes back to him.
I think we must proffer our heartfelt congratulations to Mr. David Attenborough here.
Bless his heart.
Bless his heart. Bless his Hottentot. Who moved on from the heady world of making wonderful documentary films about the mating habits of Almond and Michaela Dennis.
Bit by bit, the new channel captured a discerning audience, and a new controller took up the running.
The whole human world.
We were not in the business of producing carbon copies of anything. You should be able to look at a BBC Two programme and easily identify in it something that made it quite different from anything else on offer. And the second thing was that we would not put on mindless rubbish.
But BBC Two wasn't all highbrow.
I suppose with all this gear on, you want a vodka martini.
And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with having something different for a change? I might have a sherry. Or a gin and tonic. I might even try a cocktail.
Oh, I see. Well, I'll tell you what, mate, I'll compromise. I'll have a beer with a cherry in it.
A gin and tonic, please, and a pint.
With hours to fill on BBC Two, it was a golden opportunity to show more sport. The World Cup was coming to Britain in 1966, and BBC Two used Match of the Day to train the camera crews.
Welcome to Match of the Day, the first of a weekly series coming to you every Saturday on BBC Two. As you can hear, we're in Beetleville for this Liverpool versus Arsenal match.
Liverpool's trying to have 10 men back in defence.
We devised a method of coverage which still exists to this day.
Up to Stevenson.
It paid off because it started with an audience of 50,000 by the time it finished its run on BBC Two in May '66. It was getting 500,000.
And then it was transferred to BBC One and then just took off.
And a welcome to this week's top DJ, Jimmy Savile.
Very good, very good, very good, very good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome indeed to Top of the Pops. And how are you this evening? Hope you're all feeling very, very fit and well. And if you're not feeling very fit and well, I hope this half hour cheers you up.
There'd been a programme called Hit Parade on radio for years. And you could never do it on television because the Hit Parade basically was made up of American songs. I mean, almost exclusively, for ages, until the time of the Beatles, really. And then in the early 60s, all of a sudden, the Hit Parade was dominated by the British groups. I remember thinking it'll either be off in 6 shows, you know, if the artists won't come, it'll be off, or it'll go on forever.
After 3 successful years, the programme's popularity soared.
We were young girls, but we had a very sort of womanly sexuality about us. We were very individual. We were very different shapes. And I think men found in us, you know, a fantasy in each individual girls. Also, the fact that Flick's choreography was very sexual.
They were pretty raunchy. They were very good, and certainly appealed to the male part of the audience.
One of the costumes that we wore in it was just Louise and I dancing very sexually on cushions, and all we had was literally suction pads on our bosoms and tiny, tiny bikinis. They were very expensive because they were all beaded, but they were the smallest costume we had, but the most expensive. I mean, I think it took up the entire week's budget just for one costume.
By the time Pan's People appeared, the BBC and its Director General Hugh Green in particular were already under attack for going too far. A campaign was launched at a public meeting in Birmingham Town Hall.
Already it's a very crowded meeting. The town hall's fairly full, and I think brought in by headlines in the papers like, "What has gone wrong with the BBC? BBC slipping, TV plays unpopular, torture on the hearthrug."
Large young people, we recognise that the period between 6 and 9:15 is a period for family viewing. Well, I think we're being palmed off. Because last Thursday evening we sat as a family and we saw a programme that started at 6:35. And it was the dirtiest programme that I have seen for a very long time.
Well, if you look for the power that really created the permissive society, the permissive 60s, I think you don't have to go any further than the BBC. I think they were the voice of the new morality, with their Wednesday plays.
But the Wednesday plays were not all about the new morality. They also revealed to a comfortable audience just how bleak life could be in the so-called swinging 60s.
They were about wife beating and baby beating and drugs and all those other seamy side of life. But people liked them. People wanted to see them, there's no doubt at all. Sidney did once say, he said, if you don't get questions asked in Parliament, there's something wrong with them. And I believed that.
Oh, I see. You're newcomers, are you? Well, no men beyond the lodge. I'm afraid you'll have to get out and say goodbye to your wife now.
The feeling was there in the department. There were writers, there were people like Tony Garnett and Ken Loach. They wanted to make programmes like this, and they got the backing from Sydney, and they got the backing from the BBC.
The Labour government had already embarked on a series of controversial reforms, including the legalisation of abortion. When a Wednesday play portrayed the perils of backstreet abortion, Mrs. Whitehouse believed the BBC was taking sides. She blamed the Director General.
Money, money, money,
Sir Hugh Green, really, was a very intelligent man, and therefore he must have understood what he was doing. And what he was doing was attacking the very essence and the substance of the faith upon which Britain's civilization has been born. Oh no, he knew what he was doing. That's why he disliked us so much, because we knew what he was up to.
Mrs. Whitehouse never really affected, in my time, the policy of the BBC. I refused to see her, and I think that was right. It would have only given her publicity.
Green put out an instruction that she was not to be used on BBC radio or BBC television. Once he did that, of course, it made her a public figure. And all the press flocked round her, wanted to know her opinion about the BBC on all matters.
Oh, no, Terry, we can't. Anyway, I thought you wanted to see Sophia Loren.
Oh, what's Sophia Loren for when I got you here in the flesh?
Oh, look, Terry, well, supposing Sylvie comes home early?
She won't. She's gone up west with Ronnie. Come on, Ruby, it'll be all right.
What if I was to say no for a change?
I'll scrub you out and go and chat up Sophia Loren, won't I?
Does it mean a row?
Yeah.
All right, then, but I'm keeping my coat on.
Numerous people said to me, I resent television bringing into my home behaviour that I would never accept and never have, and my family would never have.
How far have you gone, love?
About 3 months.
Oh, then you've only got a small problem in there then, haven't you?
Yeah, well, you see, I can't keep it.
Now, there's no need to explain. How can you ever explain anything? It's the most bloody difficult thing in the world. How much money have you got, love?
And there was a very real resentment over the sexual explicitness which was seen in so many of those plays. And I think that's why, you know, the main concern was about sex.
I always thought sex quite a natural thing, and I think the first play was at Nell Dunn's Up the Junction, which had the abortion scene of the girl who had become pregnant out of wedlock. And that caused a great furor.
Hold on, love. Soon be better.
Mrs. Whitehouse and some BBC governors believed Up the Junction was unacceptable. Plans to repeat the play were cancelled. Some things she couldn't stop.
Mrs. Whitehouse, isn't it? Mrs. Mary Whitehouse. Mrs. Mary Whitehouse?
Yeah.
The clean-up TV woman. What's that all? Listen, that woman, that woman is concerned for the moral welfare of your country, isn't she?
The New Yorker or New York Times, they asked Carlton Green about the show, and they said, but it offends people. And he said, it only offends those one would wish to offend.
Look at him, he's always Lord Mary.
Yeah, well, I'm not having you, Lord Mary, not in this house.
Why not?
Because it ain't bloody ladylike, that's why. So she moved. You never started doing it neither till you took up with this scouse git.
I think a lot of it was to do with Let's Go for Broke. I think I deliberately, there was something about me that wanted to be, not to conform to this idea of being rather a lovable rogue. I wanted to be a totally hateful, awful rogue.
The ones I'm talking about, they're your proper blacks, aren't they? The ones that was born in the jungle, your natives. I mean, don't tell me they're educated. Half of them are still eating each other.
The thing is, it's got close to a lot of homes and things like that. A lot of the arguments they were having were arguments and discussions that were going on. We were destroying, if you like, the right of the authority of the father.
What are you talking about, Yid? I ain't a Yid. You're Jewish, aren't you? I ain't not Jewish!
I had a bloke come up to me at Tottenham one day and say, oh, I love that show of yours, Alf, you know, when you have a go at the coons. I said, actually, we're having a go at idiots like you. He didn't know what I was saying, he didn't know what I was talking about. And it doesn't matter. He will never know what we were talking about.
What's that million unemployed going to be doing at home all day? What are they going to...
Alf Garnett's ignorant prejudice swept like a gale through the calm waters of polite comedy.
They'll be breeding like rabbits, they will.
BBC television had recovered from its lowest ebb in the 50s, but radio was losing young listeners to pirate radio stations playing non-stop pop.
I'm not going to listen to BBC because they don't plug any good records. We're never going to have to listen to the BBC, it's bound to be dead.
The first time I went to the board with a proposal that we should attempt to provide a service of popular music, I was thrown out on my ear. There's no question about it. They treated me, you know, summarily. It was not on. This was beneath the BBC's dignity. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
This is the BBC third programme.
That was the BBC Light programme.
The BBC people at the time, when we were out on the pirate ships, they weren't really meant to communicate with us at all. And I went to a Decca record reception very close to the Palladium once, and just appearing from behind a pillar was one of the BBC executives called Teddy Warwick, who sort of went, "Hey, Tony, come here a minute." He said, "If you ever wanted to come off the pirate radio ships, I think there'd be a job waiting for you here at Broadcasting House."
Get tuned to Radio 1 or 2, 5, 4, 3. Radio 2, Radio 1, go.
The voice of Radio 1.
Basically, what happened from September the 30th constituted a revolution for BBC Radio. And I think a great many people were very surprised that we were able to do what we could. And nobody knew, actually, apart from myself, what it was going to sound like until we actually started.
Just for fun. Music too much.
And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the exciting new sound of Radio 1.
Woke up one morning, half asleep, with all my blankets in a heap, and yellow roses scattered all around.
The only people that criticised us was, fun enough, the BBC. I think we were slagged off within the organisation over the air, I think, on Radio 4, as I remember it.
We managed to get a T-shirt with "Down with Radio 4" on it, which provoked almost a revolution in the BBC club. And I remember Alvar Liddell, the doyen of announcers, actually coming to see me and saying, "Well, this is, after all, the British Broadcasting Corporation," you know, all that kind of thing.
Suddenly, in the mid-60s, a new type of film appeared which mixed carefully researched documentary fact with drama.
I'm going to have to shout to make myself heard.
Culloden was the last battle fought on British soil, and it was Peter Watkins' first film for the BBC.
Once he had made Culloden, he felt deeply that the possession of the nuclear bomb was a moral impossibility. And he felt that he would want to show what it meant if a bomb exploded, a nuclear bomb exploded over England.
Come on, quick!
This family couldn't afford to build themselves a refuge. This could be the way the last 2 minutes of peace in Britain would look.
When we started, there was a lot of cooperation from the civil defence, and we had civil defence trucks out for props and people, I think ambulances and things like that. Suddenly, they weren't there one day. Now, at the time, I had no idea what was going on because we were too busy shooting it anyway. But there was this, I always remember this moment, that suddenly there wasn't this official cooperation. Now, being a suspicious bunch of young people, we all said, OK, perhaps we're getting it right, folks. Well, in retrospect, I think, yes, we were getting it right.
Rochester in Kent. Now 2 square miles of fire, resulting from the heat of a thermonuclear missile, which has exploded off course on its path to London Airport.
Peter would say, well, there's going to be an explosion over there, and 2 others, or 3 others, but I'm not going to tell you where they are. The idea being as though you were a combat cameraman, news cameraman, on location, it was happening all around you.
Is what is technically known as a firestorm.
When we saw the rough cut, it was clear that he had produced another immensely important work. And Oliver thought that if we put either the Prime Minister in front or Field Marshal Montgomery was alive at the time at the front, it could go out late at night.
But the decision was not left to the television executives. It went to the top. The BBC's chairman, Lord Normanbrook, formerly Secretary to the Cabinet, wrote to the serving Cabinet Secretary, Sir Burke Trend.
I have seen the film, and I can say it has been produced with considerable restraint. But the subject is necessarily alarming, and the showing of the film might well have a significant effect on public attitudes to the policy of the nuclear deterrent. It seems to me that the government should have an opportunity of expressing a view about this.
Senior government officials were shown the film and reported to the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins. The government's official line was to leave the decision to the BBC.
Just a minute. Will you tell us what they're doing in there, please?
They're simply burning the bodies.
But the chairman warned,
it is clear that Whitehall will be relieved if the BBC decides not to show it.
The basis for the decision was not a political one. It was not that it would be embarrassing to the government and an aid to the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which made me decide that it couldn't be shown. It was because I could not face the responsibility of putting on the air a program which was so shocking that old people living alone, for instance, or people who were somewhat disordered, might be so much upset by it that they could go out of their flat and throw themselves under a bus, or something like that. If that had happened to one person, it would be something that one would feel all the rest of one's life.
Carefully chosen audiences were shown the film to win support for the ban. The public could only see the film in selected cinemas. The war game was not broadcast by the BBC for another 20 years.
Peter Watkins immediately resigned, saying he'd been betrayed. And to my great grief, he emigrated and literally didn't come back to England.
There is now practically a total silence in the press, in official publications, and on television.
The banning of the war game was played out against the background of the Cold War. The BBC's motto is peace, but Britain's Secret Service, MI5, were concerned that the Soviets might recruit graduates who could be used undercover once they'd achieved senior positions. One personnel manager was surprised to find talented people were being blacklisted.
There were problems connected with the appointees' political or other activities which would affect their career in the BBC. And I realized then that there were also members of staff who were already highly respected and in quite good posts who had certain limitations attached to their promotion. And this was called, in those days, the Christmas tree, because at on the very first page or second page of their personal file was a sheet of white paper with a Christmas tree in the middle of it. And this indicated that this particular member of staff was a security risk.
One such security risk was an experienced director and cameraman who found he could only get short-term contracts in regional outposts of the BBC.
A senior man in the station who had had perhaps rather too many drinks told me that an extraordinary missive had come from BBC headquarters, marked secret, and that it said I wasn't to be given any sensitive jobs, politically sensitive jobs to do, and certainly mustn't be sent abroad on any jobs. And it was because, it said in this memo he had got, I was in contact with my brother who lived in East Germany.
By the end of the 60s, student riots in Paris and demonstrations against the Vietnam War in London made the recruitment of talented students a worrying business for MI5. One promising Oxford graduate began one of the BBC's coveted traineeships, but suddenly found himself blocked.
6 months, I sat at home, ringing out regularly, saying, is there a place for me? And then in the end, I got a phone call from somebody called Owen Reed, who was head of personnel, and he invited me in, and he said to me, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on board, Mike. Absolutely super. Excellent, very talented chap. But we think it would be better if you went freelance. I thought, well, wow, I've got this packet of money, this ex gratia payment of something like 500 quid, and I'm going freelance. But just as by the time I got to Oxford Circus, it was, duh, you've been given the boot.
12 years later, The Observer published a long article which showed that Stephen Peat and Michael Rosen were just two of the BBC staff who'd been vetted and blacklisted.
Opposition MPs have called for the Home Secretary to make an immediate statement about a report that some BBC staff are vetted by MI5. The claim by the Observer newspaper has been confirmed by former members of BBC management.
The BBC says security vetting was then already under review. Today, the few staff with access to classified government information are told they're vetted in line with security legislation.
This is BBC Radio Brighton, on the air for the very first time.
With Radio 1 established, the government finally agreed the BBC could start local radio.
About 2 or 3 months before BBC Radio Brighton was scheduled to open, which incidentally was on St Valentine's Day 1968, we all repaired to the pub across the road from the Royal Pavilion Studios, and while we were in there, the Volunteer Inn it was called, a snowstorm began, and it was a very serious snowstorm which very, very quickly cut off the coast running from roughly Newhaven through to about Chichester.
Certainly on the roads, the situation is absolutely chaotic. The London to Brighton road is blocked solid with traffic for about 10 miles.
What we did was to set up an embryo local radio station to deal with this local crisis.
The jams are still building up. At the moment, I gather they're stretching well north of the King's Head.
It was the first crisis broadcast of a BBC local radio station.
Back at HQ, Hugh Green suffered a double blow. His old friend, the chairman, Lord Normanbrook, died suddenly. The new chairman was Charles Hill, the BBC's wartime radio doctor. When he was appointed, Hill headed the Independent Television Authority. The BBC's vice chairman, Robert Lusty, brought Green the news.
I shot out of my seat behind my desk. I think I must nearly have hit the ceiling. And I said to Bob Lusty, how can I work with a man for whom I have the utmost contempt?
I had many letters of congratulation, but not one, not message of any kind from the BBC or anybody there. Well, you know, I don't know how far you want me to go in this, but it was a pretty chilly reception.
Many thought Lord Hill's appointment was the revenge of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who believed the BBC treated him unfairly.
And Charles Hill, who I'd never met before, said to me in this rich, fruity sort of radio doctor voice, I don't understand why everybody is so hostile. He told me. So I said, well, you have to remember that it's rather like being in the 8th Army and waking up in the morning, having thought you'd fought rather good battles and were winning, we wake up in the morning to be told that Rommel had taken over as general. And he said, are you suggesting Rommel was a good general? And I said, no, not that. I mean, the question was he fighting for the same thing as you'd been fighting for? Understand, he said.
Yes.
Hill altered the balance of power between the chairman and the Director General. A year later, Green retired early and became a governor. But his imprint was still to be seen on the screen.
You won't have to suffer any more because of me.
You're still my wife.
I'm not! I'm not your anything!
I don't understand.
No, you don't, and you never will!
Green had seen income increase as the number of television licenses rose from 10 million in 1960 to 15 million in 1968, when colour television began another surge. The Forsyte Saga was the last great drama series in black and white.
It was a fantastic operation. I mean, 26 episodes based on 6 novels and a few extra little bits of writing, all done within 1 year. When it went to Holland, the church, the Dutch Reformed Church, had to ask the programme people to put it out to a different hour because nobody was coming to their churches.
Right.
I mean, that was the sort of effect that it had on the public.
All the same, there is something about it.
There is indeed. I'm beautiful, but don't touch. Irresistible.
First with a regular colour service was BBC Two, but it needed a new set and a colour licence at £11 instead of £6.
David Attenborough had a small surplus, and he wished to devote the surplus to a series about great peaks in European art.
Kenneth Clark had a splendid reputation at the time. We had lunch together. I mentioned the word civilization, and he, according to his own published accounts, took that away and came back with some ideas of doing it historically and so on. And so that was going to be the centerpiece of our colour output.
In 1970, Labour lost the general election. Harold Wilson and several of his colleagues agreed to take part in a documentary about the impact of being Her Majesty's government one minute and Her Majesty's opposition the next.
The programme was a catalogue of deceit from beginning to end, in its purpose, in its content, and in its presentation. And the deceit went all the way up in the end to the chairman of the governors.
Yesterday's man won't be happy until politically they are today.
It wasn't until I went to the press showing that I realised that what had been put to us as a serious documentary had become a programme that had a rock band with a satirical song, that the general approach was satirical and cynical and appeared to make some people, at least, in the shadow cabinet, money grubbing.
It is not in any sense just to say that we fraudulently misled them or that it was grotesquely fraudulent. It's absolute rubbish. They answered the questions we asked them. What's it like to lose power? How does it feel to lose half your income? How does it feel to lose your car? Do you want to be leader? All kinds of questions about personal and political loss after an election. They answered the questions. We didn't make them say anything they didn't say. We simply used their answers in a way they weren't used to, and I think that was what was different.
Harold Wilson cooperated freely with the programme, but he reacted angrily when the reporter on the film, David Dimbleby, asked how much money he'd made from the memoirs he rushed out after losing the election.
You couldn't set our minds at rest on the vexed question of what the Sunday Times did actually pay for the book.
No, I don't think it's a matter of interest to the BBC or to anybody else. It's a ridiculous question to put. Yes, and I mean it cut off. I don't want to read in the Times diary on myself that I asked for it to be cut out.
How can you put anything on film? On film, it's magnetic tape, which is infinitely reproducible, and also have that kind of row in front of 8 people and think it will be kept quiet, which he must have realised.
Despite the row, Angela Pope was allowed to film a shadow cabinet meeting the next day. Then Harold Wilson's outburst was leaked to the press. Then it was discovered the film was to be called Yesterday's Men. And confusion reigned inside the BBC about how much of Harold Wilson's interview could be used.
The governors were meeting. There were meetings going on in the leader of the opposition's office. There were judges being contacted. There were writs flying around, all this sort of stuff. There were lots of people who could sort it out. It went ballistic, and then hysteria breaks in. And so the whole thing became I mean, I've never known a row like it.
An internal inquiry by the BBC backed the programme makers, but there were other consequences.
I was a freelancer, and I wasn't asked to do any more programmes in politics. So for the short term, there was, I think, in the BBC, an atmosphere of circumspection.
Is it proper for a man who hopes one day again to be Prime Minister?
As far as Dimbleby was concerned, I ensured that while Wilson was in public life, Dimbleby never interviewed him again.
In what I've written in public, and I'll stand my corner on it.
There are more serious consequences for the BBC because there was undoubtedly a tightening of editorial control.
You know the phrase, the only important thing in broadcasting is programmes, all the rest is housekeeping. It was a victory in a way for the housekeepers, and I think that did affect the attitude of people who, not unreasonably, think of their own careers.
The row over yesterday's men sent shockwaves through the BBC and set politicians against the programme makers. It heralded an era when the range of programmes was ever expanding and improving, but the housekeepers of the BBC would come under growing political pressure.